It's after hours, so we can do whatever we want. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Himmelfarb. I'm the branch manager here at the main library, and I am very, very grateful and pleased with how tonight's program came together. I want to say a little bit about the program as a whole, introduce one of the artists who's displaying work in the gallery, actually in the other room. In this room, on these walls, just so you know, as you know, these are vintage Hatdorfs, which are paintings by Alvin Hatdorf and Helen Hatdorf, who I believe were very involved at VCU Arts, taught at the art school there. But they're things that the library has in our, I say our collection, but that's overstating it. So again, I'm Ben, I'm the branch manager here at the main library, and together with some of my colleagues, we put together Read Up Richmond every year. Whew. Can you imagine if it was every month? Every year. And the point of Read Up Richmond is to bring people together around, yes, a book or an author, a speaker event, but also around the themes in that book, around maybe the relevant history that exists, as well as any art or other types of activities that might exist. So this year our book is called Me Documents. It's also a pun with My Documents by Kevin Wen, and it's a recently published from earlier this year book about that is a speculative fiction about Vietnamese American internment in a near future. So it's a story that obviously draws on the history of Japanese American internment, but also touches on themes related to surveillance, big data, sort of the ways that we all live online in some way now, and the ways that makes us susceptible to, makes our privacy, let's say, vulnerable, which I think is kind of an uncontroversial statement. I think we're all a little more out there than we'd like to be. And on November 16th here at the library, Sunday, we're going to have Kevin, and he's going to be interviewed by an extremely gifted scholar and brilliant interlocutor, Emma Ito, who is our speaker here tonight. And before I give Emma her propers and introduce her, I want to invite up the artist whose work is in the foyer and who has done a lot of work in the city of Richmond at the intersection of art and immigration and just social connection and cultural education, Alfonso Perez Acosta. This is for the live stream, so it doesn't make you any louder.
Good. Just to pose, okay?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that much, I'm just going to say thank you for the invitation. It's a beautiful connection also to bring, different people that are talking about different immigration stories and different immigration journeys into Richmond. I'm wondering about the connections between Colombian immigration, which is where I'm from, and Japanese immigration and Chinese immigration, and like how do they relate? Very briefly, the work that you're going to see out there is work that I've been developing in Richmond for the past 10 years, or in the middle of different moments of those 10 years. Some of them have to do, some of the pieces there, drawings there, have to do directly with how different languages come into Richmond and how they connect with English. Some of them have to do with the way that different plants and healing plants come together in Richmond also to build some interesting healing circles, as we can say. And some drawings there also have to do with the way that languages connect not only when we talk, but when we hug or when we kiss. And so you're going to see some portraits of people kissing in there. I hope that you enjoy the exhibition that is going to stay here for the month of November. And thank you again for the invitation.
All right. Before we get to the pictures of people kissing, I want to say that Emma Ito, who some of you were talking with earlier, she's the Director of Education at Virginia Humanities, and she's responsible for the development, coordination, and implementation of educational resources for K-12 students, college students, teachers, and lifelong learners. Lifelong learners are our favorite at the library. Prior to working at Virginia Humanities, Emma worked a lot of different places and has done a lot of cool things. Skipping to the end, she's done a lot of research and has written beautifully on the experiences of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans in Virginia, with a focus on the time periods of Jim Crow and World War II. In her free time, Emma is an avid reader and bookstagrammer. And you're going to be able to see her again on Sunday, November 16th, interviewing Kevin Wen. Tonight, you hear from her now.
Thanks. Thank you guys so much for being here. It's really special. I feel like I haven't been in a room in Richmond with this many Japanese Americans maybe ever. Maybe at the festival. Okay, so barring festivals. So this is really special for me. Also very special, I want to shout out Alfonso some more because he's an incredible artist and I've been very lucky to work with him multiple times. So like, please take your time in looking at the art that he's done, and he's also contributed to these beautiful portraits of Asian Americans living in Virginia, which is so important to our history. So just start that out. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about Japanese immigrant and Japanese American stories in Virginia. And they're just going to be some snapshots of some different stories that I think are really compelling. But I also want to take this wider lens to think about how this history fits into Virginia history as a whole. How do we think about it when we think of terms of race and class, and we think of Black history, and we think of Indigenous history, when we think of Latin history? All of these things are actually very intertwined. So I love that you set me up for that, Alfonso, because even from what you just said, Japanese Peruvians and Japanese Canadians were actually put into incarceration camps too, and were never given redress. So there are definitely these intertwined stories, and I'm going to talk about them in a specific Virginia context tonight. Also, a really cool picture that I found last night as I was tweaking this presentation. This is a woodblock art that's done by Miwako Nishizawa. She's a Californian artist, Japanese Californian, and she came to Virginia because she was commissioned by the VMFA to do all of these scenes of Virginia. So there's these very cool woodblock images that she's done of colonial Williamsburg and Hollywood Cemetery and Cape Henry and Skyline Drive that I just think are awesome. So cool little side story. So I think it probably makes the most sense to start with the lens that I'm coming at this with, because it affects the story, I think, too. I am a mixed white and Japanese American woman. This is me and my dad. He's celebrating his 70th birthday in Myrtle Beach right now, so it's fair that he's not here. But my dad is from LA. He grew up went to USC, Southern California, and my mom's actually from upstate New York. And so they ended up meeting in Virginia and staying in Virginia. And so I was born in Richmond, and I've been here my whole life. I actually grew up in New Kent County, so it's rural area. And I went to K-12 in Williamsburg, which is, at the time, and then, God, is it 90s? I graduated in 2008, so I'm not that old. But at the time, there really actually weren't a ton of other Asian American students, and there's 2 other Asian American students at the school I was at. I was at a private Catholic school. And then my mom was actually a preacher out in King William County, which is also very rural. So Virginia is really in my blood. I also do statewide work now. So I'm in Bristol, I'm in Northern Virginia, I'm in Danville. And so I think about all these spaces and all these places, and I often am am I the first Japanese American person here? Or am I the first Asian American person here? And that's kind of a question of what is my history here? Were there people that looked like me that were walking in these places? And I'll talk a little bit about that tonight, is that there were. A little bit more too is, so these are my grandparents, rest in peace. My grandfather was born in Japan, and my grandmother was actually a Kibe, which means that she was born in LA, and actually her mother also was born in LA, but they spent almost their whole lives in Japan. So my grandmother and grandfather didn't come to the United States until the 50s, after the war. But my grandmother was actually just outside of Tokyo during World War II, during the bombings. And I was very, very close to them growing up. They actually moved to Williamsburg in 2003 to 2007, and they would talk about, and I would see them, like there were very few other Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants that they knew there. And they really kept me close to this question of like identity and history and what kind of stories might be here. My grandmother actually just passed away like 2 years ago, and she was 100. So I got a lot of time with them. I'm very lucky. And it, this all led to grad school research, and some of that you'll see tonight, of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants in Virginia. And it wasn't until the last like 2 years, almost close to when she had passed away, that I found out that my great-great-grandmother was actually incarcerated in the camps. She was put into the Utah camp, and she was 62 years old. So not only was this story already personal to me, but then it became like extra personal to me. And so much of that's a story we hear often, is that was a story not shared with my father or me, because oftentimes people don't talk about that experience. So sorry, that was a lot of background info. But I'm, like I said, I work with students and teachers, so there'll be a little bit of interaction here. But I want us to think about place, and that's something I'm going to return to a lot this evening. And so I'm curious, and I'm not going to be upset. I'm not going to be like, oh, that's wrong. But how many tribes are in Virginia? Does anyone know? Native American. Yep, Native American tribes. 7? That's pretty good. 13? Pretty good. It's pretty good guesses. So there are actually 11, but 7 was great because there's 7 state recognized tribes. There's 7 federally recognized tribes. 11 total, yeah, so you're on the money. And I think that I want to orient this talk first by recognizing like where we are and recognizing this complicated immigration history that we always talk about. We have to orient it with thinking about we are immigrants to a land that already belonged to someone. And so particularly during Native American Month, but like at all times, it's really important to think about, again, how all these histories are intertwined. There are these recurring themes of displacement, of assimilation, that I think are very important to note. And Japanese American incarceration, just like all American history, took place on occupied indigenous land. Like Gila River, one of the 10 concentration camps, was on reservation land. So there's a lot of these intersections between indigenous history and Japanese American history. Also, there were Alaskan natives that were, some of them mixed with Japanese ancestry who were also incarcerated at the camps. So it does have this multi-aspect story. And again, this idea, there's this great book called Not a Nation of Immigrants by an indigenous historian, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, that is just kind of refuting this idea that we're a nation of immigrants, that we're thinking about this on a more complicated, nuanced idea that the United States was really founded on settler colonialism and founded on the structural inequalities, which eventually lead to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. So I think it's just important to recognize that and then think about the land that we're on, the space that we're occupying, and then what that means for us and our descendants, or what that meant for our ancestors. Just a little note on terminology. You will often hear me say incarceration versus internment. And that's because Densho, they have a really good resource here that talks about some of this language, but that's because internment typically was this idea of legally permissible, morally questionable detention of enemy aliens. And that's all to say that I'm not even mad if people say internment. I think language is kind of a funny thing, right? But it's just the recognition of this was, 2/3 of which people who were incarcerated were citizens. This wasn't really legally permissible, right? This was incarceration of people. And so that's just something you'll hear me say. There's some other words that you might hear me say, like issei, nisei, sansei, and that's generational, of like which generation is coming from Japan. So like issei is first generation, nisei is second generation. Yeah, those are kind of like, you might hear me say Japanese American specifically versus Japanese immigrant. Immigrant referring to that first generation coming here. So just kind of putting that in the back of your head of thinking about language and like what words we're using around anything. Language is, like I said, a funny thing. How many of you have been to Japan? How long did it take you to get there? Roger? How long-ish? 20 hours. 20 hours? A long day. Audrey?
I always fly from LA.
Oh, okay. Well, even from LA, how long did it take you?
I mean, 12 hours.
12 hours. This was like a Google flight I looked up yesterday, dreaming of flying us all to Tokyo. But this is like connecting one stop from Tokyo to Richmond, 15 hours. When you go to Japan, it's far, right? Like it's really far, which I just like to think about that piece because it's far now. So what was that like for immigrants coming from Japan in 1880 or 1910 or 1920? I think it's really important to think about the journey and like what kind of person would you be to like leave your home in 1910 and go on a ship to New York and then like come down to Virginia. So I just think it's interesting to think about what kind of people were coming and what kind of people they might have been. So I do a lot of other presentations. This is actually from a different presentation, but I still thought it was interesting. I think there's often this myth, and I'm sorry, it's so small. It is small. I'm happy to share slides with people if you want them. I think there's often this myth that Asian immigrants and Asian Americans are new to Virginia. And while there's certainly lots of new people coming, there's actually some really rich Asian American history in Virginia. And so I'll be zooming in specifically tonight, and man, that is small, so I am so sorry. But I'll be zooming in particular tonight to the Japanese American stories. But just for some larger context, there's actually an indenture as early as 1860 of two boys, teen boys, who were 14 and 15, or 15 and 16, and an Indian boy who was 16, who were here in Virginia. To learn the art and business of farming. That's 1860. There were lots of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War. There are stories, there's this one boy his name is Thomas Sylvanus, who was fighting for the Union, and he actually was briefly imprisoned at Belle Isle. So again, not necessarily specifically Japanese American history, but like understanding this larger piece is that there were Asian Americans here and Pacific Islanders. And then, of course, I'm just going to touch on Chinese Exclusion Act for just a minute because we have to think about the way that exclusionary practices were already starting to unfold in Virginia, both nationally, but also here in Virginia. And yes, that was targeting Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants specifically. It was excluding them from being able to have citizenship. But we see in Richmond even, people just double checking. Like there's this article that says like Richmond's first celestial boy, and it was like a young boy who was born in Richmond at 1902, and his father was running around trying to make sure everyone knew that he had the paperwork that he was born in the United States so that he was a citizen because of birthright citizenship. So again, that doesn't specifically affect Japanese Americans, but that's what's happening to Asian Americans and Asian immigrants as a whole, even in Virginia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific stories, because that's what we want to hear. We want to hear about the actual people. And there were people here. There were students here before World War II, as early as 1888. And they were at schools like Randolph, Macon, and Roanoke, and U of R, and Hampton-Sydney, Union Theological Seminary. There were educators coming from Japan to speak at these universities. And it's really interesting because then we're starting to think about what was the landscape of Virginia? There were white schools. These are white schools that were closed to black students, that were closed to indigenous students. And so, there are Japanese students at these white schools, but there's also Japanese students at places like Hampton University. This is actually out of the Southern Workman, which was the newspaper of Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, which is now Hampton University. And Hampton University on its own has its really deep, rich history. It was a trade and normal school that was originally established for free people in 1868. And they had a robust newspaper. It's called the Southern Workman. And the motto was that it was devoted to the industrial classes of the South. And it's really rich and special because this is like one of the earliest resources I have where it's actually the voice of a Japanese immigrant. So many things that we look at, so many sources are often about people, but it doesn't feature their voice. And so that's why this is also just so cool, because there's this whole article here that talks about how he left Japan in July 1888 and then went over to New York and then went on to come down to, he was at Hampton for 2 years, and then he actually went to Howard after that. So this is just a fascinating snapshot of just one story. Also really cool, I was specifically looking for him. I couldn't find him in these photos, but shout out to Frances Benjamin Johnson, who was one of the first female photojournalists ever. So that's actually very cool. And then come to find out, literally found this last night. This is what happens to historians, is we go down these crazy rabbit holes and then we're like, oh my God, the presentation's tomorrow. I can't add all this. So I just I haven't actually read this, but come to find out, he consistently writes back, this is Genichiro Oyabe, consistently writes back to Hampton University, and he sends a greeting every year. Turns out he went to Howard for 5 years after Hampton, and then went to Yale Divinity School, and then went back to Japan, and then wrote this whole book, how he is the Japanese Robinson Crusoe, which I actually just ordered a copy last night, so I'll let you know how it is. But it's just fascinating, because again, there's so few sources this early, particularly about people in Virginia, that's written in English, that's written by him. So, I mean, there's a little snippet here that he talks about him coming to Virginia and him choosing agriculture for his trade because it's said is the source of the country's wealth and it's my purpose to teach it to my pupils. So just very interesting stuff. And then on the right is just some newspaper articles about another educator that was coming to Hampton Normal, as well as other visitors coming. And then there were also students, so we've got Oyabe, who's at Hampton, which is a black school, and then you have students like Ogawa, who is at Randolph-Macon, which is a white school, or closed to black students. And his story is also just fascinating, and I really just come back to this idea of what kind of person are you to come from Japan and come hang out in Virginia and live in Virginia? So he in 1904, 1905, there's all these great articles in the Times-Dispatch that talk about how Ashland's for Japan. They talk about this great student who's at Randolph-Macon and has this huge impact on Ashland, and that he was actually the son of a Japanese gentleman of wealth and high standing. And come to find out, his story is actually really rich and interesting. He became interested in Christianity when he was in Kobe. He was studying in Kobe. And his father, who was Buddhist, really disapproved of this. And so he ended up coming here and supporting himself because his parents cut him off. And they said, you're cut off from support, you're cut off from inheritance. And so what he does is he sells Bibles in West Virginia to support himself. He chops wood, and he's a janitor. So he's doing all these things. And I just think about can you imagine even now, knocking on doors in West Virginia to sell Bibles? like this Japanese immigrant, like knocking on doors. And so just to think about this then, like this is 1900s, like this is 1903, is fascinating to me. And so he's, this turns out like he ends up being this like great student that everyone celebrates. And there was this one report that talks about he lectured at Monterey Methodist Church, which I put a map here. Monterey is way out there. I don't know if you guys have ever been out there, but this is Stanton. This is Richmond. So he's like right on the border here. This is where Monterey is. So also just fascinating to think about him like in the mountains, pretty much. It said probably 300 people that came to listen to him and were just like amazed at what he was saying. And so he's all over the place, right? Like he's in Ashland, he's in Monterey, and then while he was visiting and preaching in Matthews County, which is over here, so Matthews County is like, this is Colonial Williamsburg. So again, just thinking about him like in all these spaces and all these places, and like what was he thinking? What was like? I'm so curious. I wish I could talk to him now. But while he was in Matthews County, he contracted typhoid fever, sadly, and he passed away at the age of 22. And it's actually, his story is really, really sad because once his parents found out, they had apparently like just made up, and they were looking forward to him coming back home, and they were actually very proud of him. And he died at Dixie Hospital in Hampton, which, if any of you know anything about Hampton or Dixie Hospital, like the nursing program at Hampton University was founded in 1891 as Hampton Training School for Nurses, which was then Hampton Institute. And it was one of the earliest nursing programs open to Black nursing students. So Dixie Hospital on its own has this really interesting historic history, and it was founded in 1891, and it's often remembered now because in 1863 there were the Dixie Three, which was 3 Black nurses who were fired for sitting in a whites-only cafeteria. So again, like I know you're probably like, well, what does that have to do with this? But like, you have to think about all these larger pictures of race and class and like how Japanese immigrants and Asian immigrants and Japanese Americans were interacting with people in the Black community, how they were interacting with people in the white communities. Again, like he was put into Dixie Hospital, which was a Black hospital. So, and there's another story I'm gonna tell you in a minute where he was put into another person was put in a white hospital. So this unsurety and murkiness of like, wait, so how are they supposed to be seen as? So just a quick continuation of Ogawa's story, it actually doesn't end with his death. His ashes were sent to his family in Japan, but they were stolen in London. And when the Randolph-Macon folks, faculty, students heard about this, they were just like so upset and they wanted to do something. And so they, in 1905, actually unveiled a tablet in the college chapel dedicated to Ogawa, dedicated to his memory. And the tablet, it says that it's bronze, but it's actually iron, and it's huge. It's still over there. And yeah, there's like all these little stories in Virginia. And just in the South in general, like around the same time, like, he's out in the mountains, but this is North Carolina. There's actually a photographer, George Massa, who's like photographing Appalachian Mountains, who's Japanese. So like, there's all these like really interesting stories. This is a Richmond specific story. There's also businessmen coming to Virginia. And this is Tokugachiro Abe. He came for the tobacco trade, and he actually settled in East Broad Street on Churchill. So we're very close to where he was. Again, like thinking of like space and place, and while he was here, he was held in pretty high esteem. I mean, he came from the upper echelons of Japan. And he was hospitalized at Virginia Hospital, which was later known as part of the Medical College of Virginia. So that was a hospital that was closed to Black people. So again, thinking about like interesting, differing things happening here. And so while he was here, there was actually a physician that came from Tokyo to help at his bedside, but he ended up passing away at 41. And what's really interesting is he ended up having a burial here in Virginia. He is buried in Hollywood Cemetery. So if you go to Hollywood Cemetery, again, that has its own history that we won't go down today, but you will see this giant, and I'll show it in a minute, but a giant grave site in Japanese. And apparently at his funeral, there were members of the tobacco trade that met and were just deeply upset and served as pallbearers. And he was what is it called? The funeral service was led by All Saints Church. But again, this recognition and thinking about like both race and class, right? Like he is much higher class. He was very wealthy. But so it's a little bit different story than the last story I told you. And then, so this is the actual grave that you can go see in Hollywood Cemetery in Japanese. And there's been a lot of individuals from Japan that have visited his gravesite in Hollywood Cemetery over the years, including his oldest son, Tatsui, and his grandson in 1973. And his son actually ended up writing a poem called Richmond. And I won't go over it now, but, and again, like if anyone wants access to these slides, I'm happy to share them. This is just like the translation of what was on his grave. So here we are, we're like going through the years, like we've got students coming, we've got businessmen coming, and this is just, we're in like the 1910s now. I'm trying to do this like somewhat chronologically. And so one of the things that I did, it's like a million years ago now, for my thesis was to pull out names from the census of people who were born in Japan. So this is actually a pullout of the 1910 census. And you can see people's names. If you've ever seen a census, this is what a census actually looks like. My eyes are probably so, that's why my glasses are so thick. Like, this is, you know, it's a lot of like peering at little censuses. But, you know, it's really interesting to point out a few things. This is 1910, so you'll see written race. And some people are written as JA, some people are written as JP. There are other in the 1910 census that will say C for colored. You see JAP, JAP, you see W crossed out with a JP. So again, just that murkiness of like how Japanese Americans, Japanese immigrants, Asian Americans as a whole are being viewed in this Jim Crow, or beginning to be Jim Crow Virginia. And you can see also it's mostly men. I've had a really hard time tracking down women, and it's like you were saying, we were talking about it earlier, is like a lot of women would change their names. So it's hard to find that. But it's interesting too to see, and it's actually kind of sad, but this is kind of true in a lot of genealogical work, is that particularly with Asian names, people's names are consistently misspelled. And you can imagine that makes it hard for research, but it's also just like, it sucks when people like consistently misspell names and how important names are. So I just wanted to pull out Arthur Tata, and we're gonna come back to him a couple times, but Arthur Tata and his wife Mary were listed as residents of Tanner Creek, Norfolk in 1910. And then the 1930 census reports an Arthur Tade, so T-A-D-E, in Norfolk. It's the same guy. And then he appears again in the 1940 census as Arthur Tada, so T-A-D-A. And he is still residing in Norfolk. And then by 1940, it shows that he was employed. He's working with his children, Alma and Arthur. And in a 1941 article, he's actually referred to as Wataru Tada. So you can see, like, first of all, the difficulty of like following these people's stories, but also just something to carry forward with us is like this importance of names and understanding how it is important to like write it down correctly. And like I said, we'll come back to his story because it's very interesting. So this is actually the 1910 census, and this little pullout is from, oh my gosh, right here, where he is actually on the census with his son. His daughter's not born yet. And something about the census to like make note of now is like, despite decades of denial, we actually know now that the census was given to, that information was pulled and given to the Secret Service during World War II to see where Japanese people were living. Something to take note of. So this is a really interesting article about our friend Arthur. This is 1908. This was coming out of Baltimore, and it said, Japanese to marry American girl. What do we think American means here? White, yes, exactly. So a Japanese who stated he was a merchant residing in Norfolk applied for a license to marry a Miss Mary Wiley, an American girl whose residence was given in Norfolk. After waiting an hour while the clerk was getting legal advice as to the right of a Japanese to marry an American, Taro was given the permit. So why would he go to Baltimore? Any guesses? Yeah, they couldn't get married in Virginia? Is that what you said? Yeah. Yeah, that's the closest place. This is long before Loving versus Virginia. And there's actually even a case later in 1952, called 9v9, which isn't specific, again, to Japanese Americans, but was talking about a Chinese American or Chinese immigrant who couldn't get married to a white woman. So there's even like legal cases that come out later that very specifically say that Asian Americans, Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants couldn't be married to white women. And we'll see that too with the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which I'll talk about. That case, by the way, the 9v9 case, happened 11 years before Loving versus Virginia. And that was here in Virginia, is in Norfolk, actually. And so what we're seeing, that's the local level. We're seeing just a man who wants to get married to his wife, who's been in all these censuses since 1910. He's laying down roots. There are families that are here. They have businesses. They're working. They have families. Have difficulty, in Virginia, even trying to get married to his wife. And he was able to get married. I mean, you saw they had a little bit of back and forth, but he was able to. But on a national level, at the same time, this is 1923, 1922, we're seeing these court cases by Supreme Court that say that Japanese Americans, and there's others like Asian Americans, South Asians, that cannot be citizens because they are not white. And that is the exact language that's being used, like from the Supreme Court. So there's this case, Ozawa versus the United States in 1922. This was a Japanese immigrant who challenged the United States ban on naturalized citizenship for Japanese immigrants. He argued all of these things, and essentially what we're start to see is this performance of whiteness, where belonging really hinges on proximity to whiteness. And so he's saying, like, I speak English really well, I'm a practicing Christian, I work for an American company, like, why, I am in every way American, why can't I be a citizen? And so the Supreme Court ends up saying, well, white's not actually synonymous with Caucasian, and you're not Caucasian, so you can't be white. So this is what's happening on a national scale. This is what Japanese immigrants are being told, is like, you aren't white, you don't get those rights of being a citizen. And like I said, this is happening even in response to Ozawa case. We see another South Asian man, Bhagat Thind, who in 1923 was saying, well, you said that white was synonymous with Caucasian, but my race is actually Aryan, so I should be able to be a citizen. And they actually denaturalized South Asians until the Hart-Celler Act. So again, these larger pictures of like these exclusionary laws and these people in charge and agents, like people with agency saying like, actually you don't get to have these rights because you're not white. And this is such a perfect quote by John Mitchell Jr. So this is 1920, we're now into 1920, and John Mitchell Jr., he's just like such an interesting person on its own. He was a very young editor of the Black-owned newspaper, the Richmond Planet, which was here in Virginia. I mean, he was like a tireless, like staunch, like justice seeker. He was a black man. He would like go to lynches to report on them. I mean, he eventually ran on something called a Lily Black ticket. Him on his own is like he has a very interesting story. But John Mitchell Jr. is looking at this Ozawa case, and in the Planet, he says, the color question is destined to get the United States in much trouble, as he's looking at the Ozawa case. And he continues to say, colored people are particularly observant of the situation and interested in the outcome. which is reminding us that these are intertwined histories of people navigating this racial order that was designed by white supremacy to exclude them. And it also reminds us that this history was not invisible to Black newspapers like the Richmond Planet, whose writers were very keenly aware of such examples of discrimination and white supremacy. And he actually goes on to talk about the Attorney General who is representing Ozawa, and basically says like, the Attorney General lost sight of the fact he's playing with loaded dice. So John Mitchell Jr. is very prescient in this. This is 1920, and then 1922, the Supreme Court says, basically that John Mitchell was right, but says that, Japanese immigrants cannot be considered white. So that's what we're seeing in a Virginia, that's what we're seeing in a Virginia landscape. Also, what's happening right now in Virginia is we're starting to see Virginia really entrench these binary definitions of race through something called the Racial Integrity Acts. So now we're in 1924, so I'm really zooming us through time here. But in 1912, Virginia brought along its first state registrar of vital statistics, Walter Plecker. So I'm just curious, has anyone ever heard of this name or the 1924 Racial Integrity Acts before? Cool. So I actually think this is really important because the state is essentially pushing forward Walter Ashby Plecker's thoughts about, and the Anglo-Saxon clubs of America at the time, who believed in white superiority, and they really pushed against the intermixing of races, and they pushed for that to be codified in state law. And so he eventually got to pass and advocate for these, the racial integrity laws in 1924 is to preserve racial integrity. And these laws were really specifically to protect whiteness, but it specifically prohibited interracial marriage, so really put that in law, defining a white person as someone who has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. And so remember, we know from the Supreme Court case right now, Japanese immigrants weren't being seen as Caucasian. These acts required all Virginia birth and marriage certificates to list the person's race as either white or colored, and classified all non-white people, including Virginia Indians, as colored. And so for Virginia Indians, this policy's legacy is known as paper genocide today because it effectively erased Indian as an identity. But imagine, again, these are very specific laws to be anti-Black, anti-Indian. But imagine how this is affecting anyone who's mixed or anyone who's a person of color, how it's affecting immigrants. So now they're in this racial order in Virginia that's they're supposed to be recording their race at birth. And I would argue that these state-sanctioned acts are part of the reason why we still find ourselves in a Virginia that still sees that binary distinction. There's a lot of Virginians that are like, oh, there's no Asian people here. I mean, I've heard it, the people are like, oh, there's just white and Black people here, which I truly believe is not meant to necessarily be insidious or mean, but it's just that this was law. This was what Virginia pushed, the state pushed. And this was 1924 until Loving, West Virginia. So until 67. And so, this is what's happening on the national level. On the same year as this is also the National Origins Act. So the Immigration Act, which basically introduced this national origins quota system. So it set these annual immigration quotas from each foreign country. And so it set the quotas from Asian countries to very low to try and limit Asian immigrants. Whereas Europe, that different countries, England, many more people could come. We also see as part of these is the Public Assemblages Act, known as the Massenburg Bill, which required separation of whites and colored people at public halls and theaters, any public space, essentially. And that was specifically aimed at the conditions at Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute at the time. And the university actually was just sidestepped it by saying all their functions were private. But there are members at the time of the Richmond Ministerial Union that were arguing that under this Massenburg bill, colleges in the state would actually have to provide separate seating for Chinese and Japanese students. Because as we saw earlier, there were Chinese and Japanese students that were attending these white colleges. And part of that was part of the missionary efforts of people going to China and Japan. But there's a lot of opposition to that from the Richmond Ministerial Union. Again, they were probably able to sidestep that also because they were able to say that university things were private. But yeah, these are tiny, so I apologize. This is just like, you can go see different things that pertain to the Racial Integrity Act. These are actually my pictures from the Library of Virginia. But basically, like, all to say, Walter Plecker was essentially, he had so much time. I'm like, how did you have so much time to do this? He was like writing to families and saying like, hey, so I noticed that you were white, but like, I know that your mom's mom is colored, so you're actually wrong. Like that's how much, that's like what he was doing. He was like writing letters to people. So it's very hard for me to believe that he wasn't watching the cases of Ozawa, wasn't seeing Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. I'm sure he probably wasn't seeing them as white, quote unquote. So, time is it? How long have I been talking? Okay. I'm a historian, I talk too much. So like, I'm trying to like make sure that you guys aren't falling asleep on a Friday night. So I'm gonna skip forward in time. This is really just to set the stage and think about how complex this is, right? Like here I am telling you that there were Japanese students at white schools, but there were also at black schools, but also maybe they were white people or maybe they weren't. And like, there's a lot of murky contradictions about that, and it sounds complicated because it is. I really think people were just seen by the people who knew them in the community, and that's really how they were seen. But ultimately, it's important to remember, it's not them who got to decide that, right? Like, it's whatever was in power, white supremacy that was in power, that got to really make those decisions. And so, you know, we do see people that were here. We do see just small numbers of Japanese immigrants that were living their lives and just having kids and, you know, going about their life. And then Pearl Harbor happens. And so Pearl Harbor, there's immediate reaction to the Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants that are here in Virginia. And there was a small number. And part of that is that they were able to find them so quickly is because the Alien Registration Act, which essentially required any aliens, quote unquote, like immigrants, to go to postal offices and get their picture taken and put their fingerprints. And they sent it to the INS. So just something to like think about as we think about like, why does history matter today? Like, I think it's important to try and make some of these connections to today. And so because of all of that, because of the Alien Registration Act, which is also known as the Smith Act, that night in Norfolk, specifically it says in this article, under the direct oversight of the police captain in Norfolk at the time, they very quickly, they say with lightning-like speed, picked up Japanese immigrants from Norfolk. And there's an article that talks about kind of their experiences, and there's our friend Wataru Tada, so Arthur Tada, who we followed. He's lived here a long time. He has 2 kids. He was asked what he thought of the day, and he said it's all a mess. He said the Virginian pilot said that he seemed concerned over his situation and solemn when he considered the possibility that he might have to spend the duration of the war in an internment camp. The article continues to say, this is a Virginian pilot article, with the exception of 2 of the Japanese, all arrested in Norfolk at the time had been residents for at least 15 years, and several of them had lived 35 years there or more. It identified 3 men, so Wataru Tada, Sugama Ikeda, and Sumihara. They're all a little bit older, so 38-year-old man, 44-year-old man, 51-year-old man. And the article goes on to say, additionally, all of them knew each other, and they had long been acquainted. Even the 2 who recently came to Norfolk had been acquainted with the older Japanese residents. So they definitely had their own community. But not only did the Japanese men here know each other, they were also a large part of the Black community in Norfolk. And so my friend Regina, she's not here tonight, but I was just talking to her earlier. She actually shares the story of her grandfather who was taken from Norfolk to the incarceration camps. And her and I have done many talks together. We've actually been on, there's pilgrimages that go to the camps. We've been on some pilgrimage together. But one of the people that was taken was her grandfather. And so this is, I want us to just hear her voice because this is her story. But she actually has an entire documentary. So like, if you're interested, I'm happy to send you the link. It's free. It's an NHK documentary. And just some like background knowledge too is her father, Raymond Boone, so this is her father's father, started the Richmond Free Press. So like here we are in Richmond, again, thinking about these larger pieces of space and place and identity. So I'm just gonna play this 2-minute video, or I'm gonna try to.
He was like, listen, you need to find out what happened to my dad, your grandfather, and you need to let this story be told. You've got to, show people this injustice that happened to your grandfather and show how it affected a family, our family, a Black family in Suffolk. He was arrested on the day of Pearl Harbor, just hours after the bombings, December 7th, 1941. I believe he was arrested at his restaurant because this is where he lived and worked. He was strong, he was resilient. And I'm learning about a whole nother group of people too that are a part of me, a whole community of Japanese Americans who went through this, who were wrongfully imprisoned for nothing. He was being led with his heart, and he did everything that he could to really return home to my grandmother and his boys, but he couldn't. But I can feel his pain, and I can feel the trauma. As I learn about him, I learn about me, right? So I'm like a puzzle being put back together. And as I learn about me, I learn about my father, a man that I knew so well, but actually I didn't know so well. So this research and this journey of discovering who Tsuruju Miyazaki was is like shedding light on so much more.
Incredible photojournalist on her own. So I really encourage you to hear her own story from her. And she did a fellowship where she actually went to Japan, followed his footsteps and went to the camps where he was incarcerated, went to Chicago, went to Japan, actually met family members there. So it's a really powerful story. That is a part of our story. It's part of Virginia history. It's a part of Black history, it's part of Southern history, it's a part of Asian American history. Again, how do these things all intertwine together, particularly in Virginia? And so, as I mentioned, and as Regina had mentioned in this short clip, that there were people that were taken very quickly, and this is guards, shoremen standing outside of the men that were taken in Norfolk, and they were taken to city jail later that night. And I know at least 3 of them were sent to Rower incarceration camp. So again, this other idea that this only happened on the West Coast, or this is only like a California story, it's not. It happened here too. And not only that, but it is a Southern story. 2 of the camps are in the South. 2 of them are in Arkansas, in Jerome and Rower, which I've been out there. And it's, there's actually a family there, a boy, his name is Richard Yada, he's an elder now, but he was born in the camps. He's still there. It's the thickest Southern accent I've ever heard also. But again, this idea that there aren't Asian Americans in the South, or there aren't Japanese Americans in the South is like, there are. And so I think it's also important to mention that the attack on Pearl Harbor really showed how quickly things could change. It's like, here are these Japanese Americans who are like, or Japanese immigrants who are at these white schools maybe, or in these different spaces where white people are allowed, but then this happens and they're taken pretty quickly. Fingerprinted, sent to city jail. And there were also some people that were taken, there's like one, like that was taken from like, I want to say it was like Roanoke, but there are like a couple other outliers of people. This is just another image of that Virginia pilot paper, and you can see this is page 8, so this was December 8th, and it has those images from photographer Charles Borges is his name for the Virginian pilot. And so again, like where we see a difference here versus the West Coast, and this is really interesting. This is one of the articles from this newspaper page, actually, saying, here's our friend, Wataru Tada is how his name is said here. He has a restaurant, so we followed his journey since 1910, and he raised his family here. His daughter, Alma, obtained an attorney. So this is really interesting, because we know that he married a white woman. So his daughter Alma and his son Arthur are mixed. They're white and Japanese. In California, they would have been taken to the camps. And so it's very interesting to see that his daughter was obtaining an attorney for her father, who was eventually sent to the camp. So there's that little bit of a divergence that's happening here. And like I said, he was sent to the camps, and he eventually came back to Virginia, which many people did not come back. So Regina's grandfather, for example, did not come back to Virginia. And you can imagine that's a lot of trauma that people had to go through to leave their homes. Yeah, I would imagine it would be very hard to come back. But he did, and this is actually from his grave in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Norfolk, Virginia. So he's buried there. Not that I saw, yeah. And his son was listed as a bookkeeper, so he was also working, in Norfolk. Yeah, so actually, quite a few people were sent to camps in the South, so in Rower. But yeah, there were people that were sent to West Coast camps also. They kind of split them up, but there were so few people. But yeah, they were sent to the incarceration camps. And what's really interesting is a whole other story of the homestead. So how many of you are familiar with the homestead? Have you been to the homestead? Yeah, okay, it's beautiful. I mean, I've been out there a few times. It is a luxury resort. It's very beautiful. It's a spa. But what's interesting is Japanese diplomats in DC were actually sent to the homestead after Pearl Harbor. And there's a lot of news articles that talk about them being brought by this special train, locals being really upset that they were in somewhere as luxurious as the homestead. And these are diplomats, but they were still surrounded by guards in sentry boxes. There were still guards with guns. There were barricades and a very specific, like you had to be identified by pass cards with your photograph and your fingerprints to even go in and out. And the homestead was closed to the public. So they were here. It was just a small number of people, but it's really interesting because the juxtaposition of this is right after Pearl Harbor. Dignitaries were visiting Homestead before all this. They were there with their children, just splashing in the pools. So just to think about this Virginia space that suddenly shifted, and even though it's a luxurious, incarceration, it's still incarceration. And so there's actually even a spread in a Life magazine in 1942. This is actually from that Life spread. And the article was, "The Homestead, a great hotel entertains Jap diplomats as patriotic duty." So that's like kind of some of the language that's being used of like, the regular patrons can't be there right now, but we'll reopen it. Don't you worry. Their visitation will be gone. And you see a lot of nearby newspapers that are local saying just incredibly racist things about these dignitaries, saying, this is a quote, "Old Soul was positively beaming on April 4th when the 285 little yellow sons of shoguns were herded on the train." So obviously there were people that were very upset that the dignitaries were here, and they were eventually sent actually to Sulphur Springs after Hot Springs. So yeah, it's just, again, thinking of that juxtaposition of like, here's this luxurious place, and that has really shifted. And it's just fascinating. I remember, and maybe this has changed, like I remember doing thesis work, like this is like so long ago now, but I found very little that the homestead talked about this history. But as you'll see, as I go into some other things, like this is actually part of a larger national monument now, recognizing Japanese incarceration. So our story in Virginia is actually being told by other people nationally, and we don't even know it here. So I think it's really important to talk about it. We're also starting to see, as the camps are, as early as 1942, camps are starting to let students leave the camps early to attend college. And Japanese American students weren't allowed to attend college in the West. They were only allowed to come to Midwest and East schools to continue their education. So we do start to see some students come back here. There's, for example, a student in 1940 that's at the Presbyterian School of Christian Education. So again, we see that connection with Christianity, we see missionaries. But then we also have this story of Kai Kaneda, and she's right here, actually. And she was living in the home of Henry Mack, who was a Richmonder here. And he just, I had interviewed a long time ago his daughter, Margaret, and she was saying that he was just so upset that these camps were happening and that he had to do something. And so he just kept writing back and forth to try and just like pull someone out of the camps, and he was able to get Kai out of the camps, which is just very interesting on its own. But she was actually living with his family until she died in 1998. And he would actually, like, they would go out to churches, and he would like, we're not gonna go down this path because it is like its own complicated, complex thing, but he would like take her to churches to say basically like, look, she's a US citizen, she's not dangerous, like why are we incarcerating people? It's just an interesting aspect. You know, she lived and went to school in Richmond, and she was here. And there were also like other students like in Northern Virginia. This is Father Nakajo, who was a graduate student in Alexandria. So there did start to be this trickle. Yeah, of course.
It seems like a couple people you're talking have been very, like, gone to seminary, and I don't know if it was in Alexandria, also the seminary is there.
Yes, yep, you're right.
Is that part of your immigration story? Like, one of the guys you said specifically, like, his parents did not approve.
Yes,
And
yes.
is that how a lot of Japanese immigrants ended up in the United States?
So in the United States or in Virginia?
Well, Virginia.
Okay, so Virginia is a little bit more complicated because we see a lot of people coming through Norfolk because of the naval base.
Okay.
So like even in that 1910 census, you can see like there were people coming through Elizabeth City, Portsmouth, as like cooks or working at like the naval hospital and stuff. So we see a lot more of that here.
They were coming from Japan to work in the Navy?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, that was a path many immigrants took to try and have naturalization or bring their families here. That's a great question.
I'm just very curious because the first guy you talked to went to Yale Divinity School, the
Yeah.
guy became a minister, that guy became
Yeah.
a minister. I wonder if, you know, there was some kind of...
Yeah, and there was a lot of push for missionary efforts to go to Japan. And so we do see a lot of that. Yeah, definitely. I think the camps gets a little more complicated because like with Kai, for example, like she was probably Japanese American. And there, you know, again, like there's a lot of Japanese Americans, like second, third gen that are in these camps. But that would leap at the chance to go to schools. Many of them were in school. So like to be able to leave camp early because they were going back to college, that was also like an opportunity that people would try and take. Thank you, that was a great question. And so I just wanted to also mention the 442nd because I think their experiences as they came through Virginia are also very interesting. Is anyone familiar with the 442nd by chance? So for my military history people, which don't worry, I'm not a military historian, but I don't know that much about military stuff. But the 442nd is one of the most decorated combat teams in World War II. They were an all Japanese American unit. They were Nisei, so second generation. And it's actually really sad because their history was on the US Army page, and I think it got removed and then republished, so I'm not actually sure what was lost, and that was as like this past March. But they were Nisei soldiers who fought in World War II. And we see a couple different experiences of these 442nd veterans come through Virginia and talk about the segregation here. So there's this man named Hideo Hoshide, who's right here, and he talks in his interview about when he first came to DC, he saw that the bus was segregated and he didn't know where to sit. And so like this is a recurring theme, right? Of like, we're like, oh, I'm not sure if I should like be here or there. Am I allowed to be here? And so on that bus, he said, and this is quote, "In between, I thought it would be a safe place." And he had no problem on that particular bus ride, but had to change buses in Alexandria and was faced again with this issue of like, I'm not sure where to sit. And he said, it was kind of a big question that I didn't know where to go, but there was a lady sitting on the front side and she heard me talking to the driver. He went on to say that the white woman who had overheard him invited him to sit next to her. And then he added later that he met with workers from the Office of Strategic Services, so OSS, and he mentioned this. And they told him, quote, "You know, when you're over here, there's only two classifications. You're either a white or black. There's nothing in between." To which he responded, "Well, I'm yellow race." And their response to him was, "Well, you're a white." And so I think this interaction highlights, just as the census takers, may not have been sure what race to categorize Japanese people with, he was also himself unsure. He said, "I didn't know how I should act, whether I'm black or white." And I think that's this reoccurring question that we come back to is like, how did these people navigate in this Jim Crow Virginia, where it was segregated, where it was the state saying there's only white and black people. So again, these experiences I think are really important to mention. And so I mentioned Homestead, and one of the things I wanted to just show you really briefly is there's actually a national monument that has been put together for World War II Japanese American incarceration. And this is more of a recent monument. It's called Ire. And it has like these three distinct interlinking elements. There's a sacred book of names as a monument. So people will go and stamp family members or people they knew's name who were incarcerated. So every single person that's incarcerated. So I've actually stamped my great-great-grandmother's name and a great uncle. And there's a website that has all of these names available. But there was also this like sculpture piece and these wood, which I'll show you a quick video, it's like 2 minutes, that includes the soil from 75 different incarceration sites. And so one of those sites is Homestead. I went and collected the soil from Homestead. I was part of this, I was a representative for one of the sites for this huge, recognition of incarceration, and that it was something that happened all over the country. And this was kind of out of a project with USC, but also with the Japanese American National Museum, which is out in LA. Yep, so actually, the book is traveling right now. So I'll show you guys just kind of it makes more sense, I think, to visually put it together. Yeah?
Do you know where they fought at before?
The 442nd?
Did they fight in the European theater?
European theater, yeah. They were not like allowed to go to, yeah. That's a great question. See, there's my military historian, my military questions. Oops. So I just wanted to show this video because I think it's important to think about, again, how Virginia is represented in this larger national monument, but also thinking about all these intersections, again, that I'm coming back to. Like I told you that 2 of the camps the idea was to put them on Indian reservations, and one was put on Gila River, where the tribe there said that they would protect that space to recognize that there were people incarcerated. So there's a lot of really deep relationships with that tribe in particular. But interweaving these memories of displacement and incarceration. So this is just like a 2-minute clip of this national monument. This is out in LA at the Japanese American National Museum.
Here in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, we gather at the very site where persons of Japanese ancestry gathered 80 years ago. We now proclaim the Ide-cho as a national monument to the wartime incarceration by opening the cover of this sacred book of names. We carry with us the gate of wood, the wooden tablets on which the names of 75 U.S. internment and concentration camps are recorded, by bringing forth the very soil of incarceration by camp survivors, descendants, those associated with the preservation and education about the camps, and clergy and faith leaders.
From the bombing of Pearl Harbor that shattered our everyday lives, we remember. From the roundup and imprisonment of our Issei leaders, priests, ministers, and community leaders, we remember. From the signing of Executive Order 9066 that forced our evacuation, we remember.
I hope you remember that this book represents people. There are people in this audience whose names are in this book. There are people in this audience whose families are in this book. There are people in this audience whose friends and loved ones are in this book. But they will put their stamp next to their family's name, their friend's name, to remember them and acknowledge them.
And so I show that to again show that this is a piece of Virginia history that is being nationally recognized, that I think many of us don't even realize Virginia, like we don't even recognize it. But also, I think it's really important to think about like how we memorialize these things, how we talk about them. What are our own family stories? Like how do we think about memory of our own family's histories today? In what ways do our family's stories intertwine with all the history I've talked about today? I just like ran through a span of Virginia history from like 1900 to now, to like, you know, this is well, this is now, but to the camps and post camps. So, you know, like how do we think about ourselves within this larger landscape of many different people? And so I'm just gonna kind of wrap up because I don't think you guys want to hear me for an hour, but if you want to, I can keep talking, but I'm not gonna do that to you on a Friday. But I just wanted to mention a few kind of contemporary journeys, again, specific to Virginia. And like I said, I do lots of other presentations, so like you may see different things interspersed. I've done some on Asian American history in Virginia, on solidarities specifically of like Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants with other communities nationally. But Virginia has some really specific spotlights that I really wanted to just highlight. One person is Mary Hasegawa. She has been honored by the Library of Virginia as a Virginia Woman in History. And I was too young, but she was here in Richmond. And during the 1960s, she was part of the Virginia Office on Aging. And she was deeply affected by her own experiences in the incarceration camps in Utah, which is actually where my great-great-grandmother was, and on the use of the atomic bombs in Japan. And so she really believed in freedom and social justice were necessary to achieve this world peace. And actually, even even recently, I was just chatting with Regina Boone, who was in that short documentary we watched earlier, and she was telling me that Mary and her father were friends. So like even thinking about that other solidarity piece together. We are also like one of the early states, like first states, I think one of 7, maybe there's more now, that commemorate the birthday of Fred Korematsu. This is Mark Keem. He was the delegate who pushed for this, but Fred Korematsu was a Japanese-American civil rights activist, and he's best known for resisting the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so I think and Korematsu Day was the first day in US history named after an Asian American. But I think it's really kind of funny that like we do recognize this. Virginia recognizes Korematsu Day on January 30th. It's like Arizona, California, Florida, Hawaii, Michigan, New Jersey, and Virginia. So we're on that list. Oh no. Oops, I took us on a journey here. There are also markers, which actually, shout out Latoya, I see that you're here. There are historical markers of Asian Americans and of a Japanese American, Arthur Matsu, who's pictured here. He's actually Japanese American and Scottish, so his story is really interesting, but he was the first Asian American student at William and Mary in 1927, and he was a really renowned football player. People loved him. He's in so many newspaper articles. But also recognizing, you know, there are some historical markers recognizing Asian American Pacific Islanders, but this is 5, you know, there's only 5. There's more than, 2,900 historical markers across Virginia. And this actually came out of something that then Governor Northam, he ran a student contest. So these were actually submissions by students. Very cool. So they did all the research together. Actually, a teacher I work with did the one. High school, middle school students in one of the cases, and just that shout out of like understanding and thinking about place again, like what may have happened around you that should be recognized. You know, what's important to our youth right now and students. And so like, yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in talking about how maybe teachers can work with classes to submit these markers, but that's my real job. So feel free to ask me about that. And just because we're in Richmond, there are some really good stories in the Generations exhibition right there at the Valentine. It's really close to us. And there are at least 4 Japanese Americans or 4 Japanese immigrants in that exhibition. So, you know, just thinking about like contemporary stories. And I haven't done as much on like contemporary. I look more at like 1945 and like 1880 to 1945. But just know that there are stories out there, but I hope that there's more. I hope that everyone thinks, no matter who you are, whether you're Asian American, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're mixed race, like that these stories do intersect. And so thinking about ways of how they intersect, but they're also very important. Like your story is important. It is a fabric of Richmond. Like in some ways, like I don't want to say this is historical that we're here, but like it is kind of a big deal that we're here talking about Japanese Americans that we're here. You know, like some people don't want to talk about Japanese American incarceration. And you know, there were people post-incarceration who like really didn't want to talk about incarceration. So, you know, what lessons can we take from that? And what can we think about our own family stories? And so I have this like soft ending. I do have some more slides in solidarity if you want to see them, but I also recognize it's like 7:50. So I really encourage you to like reach out to me. Some of us were chatting about like, maybe we should just do like a big potluck or something. Like I never get to eat good Japanese food, and my grandfather was a chef, so I'll just tell him we're all rolling up for some Japanese food. But you know, like feel free to reach out to me. This is actually my dad and my brother and me marking the book. We were both at that ceremony, but then on another trip we went and marked the book together. So yeah, I'm happy to like answer questions, or if you want to see those exercises and solidarities, or if you just are like, that's a lot of history on a Friday night. And I'm also happy for that. So yeah, thank you again so much for being here tonight. And I really appreciate you, and I hope that you tell your stories, because it's important. Yes.